Imagine hiking deep into one of the most unforgiving mountain ranges on Earth. No roads, no villages, no cell phones, just endless snow, freezing temperatures, and silence. Now imagine that weeks later, rescuers finally find your campsite. The tent is still standing, but something is horribly wrong. Fabric has been slashed open from the inside. Your boots are still sitting neatly inside the tent. Your winter jackets are untouched. Yet every person who slept there fled barefoot into the freezing darkness. Some were found frozen beneath a tree. Others had skull fractures so severe they resembled the injuries from a high-speed car crash, yet there were no external wounds. One woman was missing her tongue. To this day, no one knows exactly what happened. For more than 60 years, scientists, investigators, and conspiracy theorists have argued over one question. What terrified 9 experienced hikers enough to abandon everything they owned and run into the frozen wilderness? This is the story of the Dyatlov Pass Incident. And by the end, you'll understand why it remains one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. It was January 1959. The Soviet Union was in the middle of the Cold War. While the world worried about nuclear weapons and the space race, 9 young adventurers prepared for a challenge few people would dare attempt. Their destination was the northern Ural Mountains, a place famous for brutal weather, blizzards, and temperatures that regularly dropped below -30 degrees Celsius. The expedition was led by a 23-year-old engineering student named Igor Dyatlov. He wasn't reckless. He was one of the most experienced hikers at the university. The rest of the team was just as capable. They had completed some of the Soviet Union's most demanding hiking routes. Many held the highest certification available for wilderness expeditions. These weren't tourists. They were experts. Each member knew how to survive freezing temperatures, navigate through storms, and work together when conditions became dangerous. Before leaving, they carefully packed everything they would need: heavy winter clothing, axes, food for weeks, medical supplies, cameras, diaries, even spare skis. Every detail was planned. Their goal was to reach Otorten Mountain. Ironically, local folklore translated its name as something close to "don't go there." The hikers laughed at the superstition. To them, this was simply another adventure. On January 23, the group boarded trains and trucks heading north. As they traveled farther into the wilderness, civilization slowly disappeared behind them. Their final destination before entering the mountains was a small logging settlement. It would be the last place they would ever see other people. Photographs taken during those final days show smiling faces, friends joking together, snowball fights, people excited for the adventure ahead. Nothing in those images suggests fear. Nothing hints at the tragedy waiting only days away. One member of the expedition, Yuri, became sick shortly after the journey began. Severe joint pain forced him to turn back. Reluctantly, he said goodbye to his friends and watched them disappear into the snow. At the time, he believed he'd see them again in a few weeks. Instead, Yuri would become the only member of the expedition to return home alive. And for the rest of his life, he would ask himself the same heartbreaking question: what if I had stayed? The remaining 9 hikers continued climbing deeper into one of the most isolated regions in the Soviet Union. Every step carried them farther from help, farther from civilization, and closer to whatever waited for them on that mountain. The expedition officially began on January 27, 1959. The 9 hikers strapped on their skis and disappeared into the endless white wilderness of the northern Ural Mountains. Every day followed a familiar routine. Wake before sunrise, pack the tents, eat a simple breakfast, then ski for hours through deep snow and bitter winds. At night, they built camp, cooked together, laughed, and wrote in their journals. Those journals would later become one of the most important pieces of evidence investigators had. Reading them today is unsettling, not because they describe fear, but because they don't. The entries are surprisingly cheerful. The group joked constantly, they teased one another, sang songs, and even wrote humorous newspaper-style articles about their expedition. One journal entry described the freezing temperatures with sarcasm. Another joked about the difficult terrain they were crossing. Even when conditions became exhausting, morale remained high. The photographs recovered from their cameras tell the same story. Smiling faces, friends helping one another across frozen rivers, someone posing with skis over their shoulder, another laughing while setting up camp. These weren't people expecting disaster. They looked like friends making memories. As the days passed, however, the landscape became harsher. The forests grew thinner. The mountains became steeper. Strong winds blasted across the exposed slopes. Snow drifted several feet deep in places. Visibility often dropped to almost nothing. Still the group pushed forward. They had trained for conditions exactly like these. By February 1st, the hikers had reached the eastern slope of a mountain known locally as Kholat Syakhl. Its name, given by the indigenous Montsi people, is often translated as Dead Mountain. Despite its ominous name, there was nothing supernatural about it. The mountain was simply barren, exposed, and brutally cold. That afternoon, weather conditions deteriorated rapidly. Powerful winds swept across the mountain. Snow began reducing visibility. Investigators later believed the hikers accidentally drifted off their planned route. Instead of descending into the nearby forest for shelter, they found themselves exposed on the mountainside. Turning back would have meant losing valuable time, so Igor Dyatlov made a decision. The team would camp right there on the slope. At first glance, it wasn't an unreasonable choice. Experienced mountaineers sometimes camp on open terrain to save time the next morning. The hikers worked together to carve a flat platform into the snow. Then they pitched their large canvas tent. Inside, they arranged their sleeping bags side by side. Their boots were neatly lined up. Heavy winter coats were placed where they could easily be reached. Food was unpacked. A small meal was prepared. Someone snapped a final photograph. It would become one of the most haunting images ever recovered. The picture is blurry. Snow fills the air. Dark figures struggle against the wind while setting up camp. No one in that image knew. It would be the last photograph ever taken of the group alive. As darkness settled over Dead Mountain, the temperature dropped even further. Outside, the wind howled across the empty slope. Inside the tent, 9 experienced hikers settled in for the night. They had survived every challenge the mountain had thrown at them. There was no reason to believe tomorrow would be any different. But sometime after sunset, something happened. Something so sudden, so terrifying, that 9 trained mountaineers made an almost unimaginable decision. They didn't unzip the tent. They didn't put on their boots. They didn't grab their coats. Instead, they cut their way out of the tent from the inside and ran into the freezing darkness. The group was expected to return by February 12th. If they encountered bad weather, a delay of a day or two wasn't unusual. Their families weren't worried. Neither were the university officials. After all, these hikers were experienced. But as the days passed, silence replaced confidence. February 13th came and went. Then the 14th. Still no word. By February 20th, nearly a week after the group should have returned, rescue teams were finally organized. Students, volunteers, experienced mountaineers. Later, soldiers and aircraft joined the search. No one imagined what they were about to find. On February 26th, a search team spotted something on the snowy mountainside. It was the expedition's tent, half buried beneath drifting snow. From a distance, it looked almost normal. But as rescuers approached, the scene became deeply unsettling. The tent was still standing. Not collapsed. Not destroyed. Inside were sleeping bags, clothing, food, maps, diaries, cameras, even boots. Everything the hikers needed to survive remained exactly where it should have been. It looked as though they had simply stepped outside and never returned. Then investigators noticed something even stranger. Several long cuts had been made through the canvas. But they weren't cut from the outside. The fabric had been sliced from the inside. Whoever made those cuts wasn't trying to get into the tent. They were desperately trying to get out. Imagine that for a moment. 9 experienced hikers, instead of taking a few seconds to unzip the entrance, destroyed their own shelter in temperatures below -30 degrees Celsius. Why? What could possibly frighten experienced mountaineers so badly that cutting through frozen canvas seemed faster than using the door? No one had an answer. The mystery deepened almost immediately. Leading away from the tent, searchers discovered footprints. Not scattered. Not running wildly. but walking. Some barefoot. Others wearing only socks. A few wore a single boot. The footprints continued for nearly a mile down the mountain toward a small forest. Despite the freezing conditions, there were no signs of panic. No signs of a struggle. It almost looked as though the hikers had calmly left the tent, knowing they weren't properly dressed. It made no sense. No experienced mountaineer would willingly leave shelter without boots or heavy clothing. Especially at night. Especially during a snowstorm, unless whatever was inside the tent seemed even more dangerous than the freezing cold outside. Following the footprints, rescuers eventually reached the edge of the forest. There, beneath a massive cedar tree, they found the first two bodies. Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko. They were lying near the remains of a small campfire. The fire had burned itself out long before rescuers arrived. The two men wore almost no clothing. Their hands were badly damaged. The bark high on the cedar tree had been stripped away. Broken branches reached more than 5 meters above the ground. It looked as though someone had climbed the tree in a desperate attempt to see something back on the mountainside. Or perhaps to escape something below. The investigators couldn't be sure. Even more chilling, the branches were broken while they were still alive. Their hands showed signs of gripping the bark until their skin tore away. Whatever happened, it happened before they died, between the cedar tree and the abandoned campsite. Rescuers found 3 more bodies, one by one, spread out across the snow. It appeared they had been trying to return to the tent. The first was Igor Dyatlov himself. Just a few hundred meters farther lay Zinaida Kolmogorova. Then Rustam Slobodin. Each had fallen where exhaustion finally overcame them. It looked as though they had made one final attempt to reach the safety of their shelter. But they never made it. 5 hikers had now been found. Every one of them had died from hypothermia. At least, that's what it seemed. The official explanation appeared straightforward. They fled into the cold and froze. Case closed. Except for people were still missing. And when rescuers finally found them months later, everything changed. Because those 4 weren't just frozen. They had injuries so severe, doctors compared them to victims of high-speed car crashes. Without a single major wound on the outside of their bodies. 1 had a crushed skull. 2 had shattered rib cages. And 1 was missing her tongue. The mystery was only beginning. As winter slowly gave way to spring, investigators had recovered 5 of the 9 hikers. On paper, the explanation seemed simple. They had fled their tent in the freezing cold and succumbed to hypothermia. But there was one major problem. 4 people were still missing. The search continued for weeks. Snowstorms buried the mountains. Temperatures remained dangerously low. Every day that passed made it less likely anyone would be found. Then, nearly 3 months later, on May 4th, rescuers made a grim discovery. Hidden beneath nearly 4 meters of snow, inside a small ravine about 75 meters beyond the cedar tree, lay the remaining 4 hikers. They had somehow reached the ravine and attempted to build a shelter. Branches had been cut. Snow had been dug away. It appeared they had fought desperately to survive. But something had happened before they died. Something investigators had never seen before. The first body examined belonged to Ludmila Dubinina. The medical examiner was stunned. Several of her ribs had been crushed with extraordinary force. The fractures weren't small. They were massive. Doctors later compared the impact to the kind of trauma seen in high-speed car accidents. Yet strangely, there were almost no external wounds. No deep cuts. No severe bruising. No injuries that matched such devastating internal damage. It was as if an enormous force had compressed her chest, without breaking the skin. The same was true for Semyon Zolotaryov. His rib cage had also been shattered. Again. Very little external damage. Then came Nikolai Thibault-Brignol. He had suffered a severe fracture to his skull. The force required to cause it should have left obvious injuries. But once again, the outside of his head showed surprisingly little damage. The medical examiner would later state that these injuries required an incredible amount of force. Far greater than a fist. Far greater than a simple fall. So what caused them? No weapon was ever found. No evidence of another group appeared at the scene. No signs of a fight. No footprints besides those of the hikers themselves. The injuries remained unexplained. Then investigators noticed something that would fuel decades of speculation. Ludmila Dubinina's tongue was missing. So were parts of her lips. Some soft tissue from her face was gone. Her eyes were missing as well. At first glance, it sounded horrifying. Almost impossible to explain. Rumors quickly spread. Had someone attacked the hikers? Had they encountered something unnatural? Or had investigators covered up the truth? Modern forensic experts offer a much more ordinary explanation. Because Dubinina's body had lain submerged in icy water beneath deep snow for months, natural decomposition and scavenging animals likely removed soft tissues first. It's a disturbing reality, but one commonly seen in forensic investigations involving long-exposed remains. Still, for many people, the image of the missing tongue became one of the most enduring symbols of the Dyatlov mystery. Just when investigators thought the case couldn't become stranger, another discovery emerged. Several pieces of clothing belonging to two hikers showed elevated levels of radioactive contamination. That single fact ignited decades of conspiracy theories. Secret military experiments. Nuclear weapons testing. Hidden Soviet cover-ups. But once again, the truth is less dramatic than it first appears. At least one member of the expedition had previously worked in an industrial environment where radioactive materials were present. Some experts believe the contamination may have existed before the expedition even began. Others argue the levels detected were relatively low and not unusual for that era. Even today, there is no agreement. Investigators now faced an impossible puzzle. The tent had been cut open from the inside. The hikers fled without proper clothing. They walked calmly into the freezing night. Some attempted to return. Others built a fire. For reached the ravine. 3 suffered catastrophic internal injuries. No attacker. No weapon. No clear explanation. Finally, the Soviet investigation reached its conclusion. The official report did not blame an avalanche. It did not blame criminals. It did not blame wildlife. Instead, the investigators wrote that the hikers had died because of a compelling natural force, the cause of which the hikers were unable to overcome. That single sentence raised more questions than it answered. What exactly was that compelling force? Why wouldn't investigators name it? Were they uncertain? Or were they prevented from saying more? For decades, those questions would haunt everyone who studied the case. And as the years passed, new theories would emerge. Some grounded in science. Others far more extraordinary. In the next part, we'll examine every major explanation, from avalanches and powerful mountain winds to secret military weapons tests, and ask the question that still divides experts today. What really happened on Dead Mountain?